Welcome once again to the Committee for Workers International live broadcast. And we'd like to give a very warm welcome to our viewers again. And we'd like to appeal to you once again that if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel on CWI Media, to do so. And also, of course, if you'd like to follow any of our other analysis and news reports, you can find it on our webpage at socialistworld.net. Now, of course, since last week, we've seen a further dramatic change in the global situation with an intensification of the health crisis. We have a devastating situation unfolding in the United States. Latin America today has now been reported as having the highest numbers of deaths and infections. We see the virus ravaging through the poor areas, in particular in India and other areas of Asia as well. In addition to that, we see the intensification of both the economic crisis, but the tsunami of unemployment figures coming out in country after country, which have dramatically increased. We've seen increased tensions within the EU, with a major conflict brewing in relation to how the corona funds are allocated to the different countries. And in addition to that, we've seen an incredible intensification of the political crisis in the United States and also here in the UK. Trump's support in the opinion polls has plummeted. We've seen an incredible position where he's intervened to spring from jail one of his former advisors, Stone, provoking uproar and further divisions amongst the ruling class in the United States. And now, of course, we see the development of even further conflict between US imperialism, some sections of the European capitalist class as well, and China. And of course, it's that issue that we're going to concentrate on today in our discussions. We've seen today the government in the UK has announced that it's going to block the Huawei telecommunication input into the 5G program. They want that entirely removed, they say, from the system by 2027. Well, that happens, we'll have to see. And of course, within this general context, we've seen an intensification of China, of the conflict rather, between China and the United States. It's a reflection of the diminishing position of US imperialism and the growth of Chinese imperialism and Chinese capitalism, which has been dramatically accelerated during the course of this crisis. And that's reflected in an increase in military tensions in the South China Seas. And to discuss those developments today, we have with us Claire Doyle from the International Secretariat of the CWI, and we're also very privileged to be joined by Carl Simons from Osaka, Japan, who's going to give us a little bit of a take on the situation there, because of course Japan is plunged right into the middle of this particular conflict which has opened up internationally. So perhaps, Claire, we could begin with you. Now, one of the major developments that we see in the recent period has been the outpouring of mass protests in Hong Kong, and that's now been followed as the Chinese have stepped in with quite brutal methods of repression. We've seen repression increased, arrests taking place, a clampdown onto the internet, and a whole series of other repressive measures taking place. So, Claire, maybe you could outline the situation in Hong Kong at this stage, and also particularly develop how has the opposition reacted to this, and what do you think it could do in order to fight against the clampdown and repression which the Chinese regime is trying to introduce into Hong Kong?
Yes, well, it was just 2 weeks ago that this security law was imposed on Hong Kong, actually at 11 o'clock, an hour before midnight, on the last day of June, which is supposed to be able to arrest people and punish them for things like secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign powers, and the punishments can range from very small fines, a short time of imprisonment, or life imprisonment, and actually death, even imprisonment on the mainland of China, you know, in the horrific conditions that exist there. I mean, this is a financial and trading hub known as Hong Kong, where China does a lot of trade, and a lot of the countries, the rest of the world, also depend on it. But how far they're going to go in imposing this law, which was discussed originally at their sort of rubber stamp Congress, then it was passed by their rubber stamp Parliament, as everybody likes to call them. How far they're going to go in actually using this law remains to be seen. I think, the authorities are still weighing it up, and I think the protesters are still weighing it up. In fact, the first day after this security law was announced, the following morning, there were thousands of demonstrators on the streets facing the riot police, not much different from what's been going on for the last year, where the democracy movement was only actually interrupted by the COVID crisis, and they were back on the streets again at the beginning of June to commemorate the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. They were back a few days later to celebrate a year of the democracy movement, which has seen millions on the streets in Hong Kong. So they were out on the streets again on July the 1st, not knowing what was going to happen to them. We know that young people have gone on to demonstrations in the past year, not knowing what was going to happen to them, carrying wills in their pockets, their will and testament about what should happen if they were killed in these battles. Luckily, only 1 or 2 people have died over the past year. But they would go out with that same determination on the first day after this declaration. It was actually to celebrate or to commemorate the end of British rule in 1997, so 23 years without British colonial rule, and supposed to be one country, two systems, which would anyway finish after half a century. But Beijing had moved in. People were demonstrating. 370 were arrested, but only 10 of them were actually charged under the new security law, and they were released. It remains to be seen what actually happens to them. As I say, I think there's a testing out on both sides. And then there was a period of days with everybody thinking about it, with some of the pro-democracy leaders actually leaving the country, leaving Hong Kong, saying they were going to set up a parliament in exile. Unfortunately, some of them looked to the US as a kind of savior. They looked to so-called democracy of the US, where actually the president has ignored all the human rights violations in China as long as trade was going ahead. I think we'll move on to that in a moment about the economic side of things. But you see that just last Sunday, at the weekend, there was about 600,000 people queued up to vote in a primary for pro-democracy candidates to stand in the elections, which are due this autumn. And it shows defiance, it shows courage. The policies may be confused, muddled, we can come on to that. But it seems as if Beijing actually wanted to move quite quickly, partly because they thought other powers, were having to deal with the COVID crisis, which indeed they were. The worst slowdown in the US since the 30s. We know, we discussed it on these programs many times. But they were probably hoping that they could move in and they could prevent a resurgence of the movement by putting through these security laws. But 500,000 people, and I think they probably were worried about these elections in the autumn, that it could see a majority of pro-democracy candidates being elected, like they were last year, I think it was in November, when there were the elections for the local council. They're all a bit distorted. We can't imagine that it's just been ordinary democracy in Hong Kong over this period. Very, very much not so. The demonstrations last year were all for 5 very basic democratic rights, which don't exist in the Hong Kong of today. But I think Beijing was worried about the pro-democracy representatives getting a majority in the LegCo, this strange kind of parliament, and they've moved in. What's going to happen next? We don't know how openly any political opposition will be able to operate. It remains to be seen. I mean, China, as you said, Tony, is stronger in terms of its economy, and it's ahead of other countries in dealing with the crisis. But we don't know how far they're going to be able to go with the clampdown. I think we come later to discuss how the pro-democracy movement needs to react and needs to organise. Those who are prepared to stay. Some have left, but a lot of fighters on the streets from the past year have had, they don't have any alternative. They've stayed and they want to fight. Of course, some big business and HSBC and banks and so on are quite happy with this clampdown because it brings a little peace on the streets and they can get on with business as usual.
Well, thanks, Claire. I think that clearly illustrates the scale of the movement that's taken place in Hong Kong itself and what the Beijing regime has tried to do. Now, of course, China has been fully integrated into the global economy for a whole period. There's been a phenomenal growth, as you indicated, where I think its percentage of the world GDP has risen from about 4% up to about 14% at the present time. So it's been fully integrated and forms a crucial part of the global economy. Now, this rivalry between US imperialism and China has now led to all sorts of clashes, and we've seen a change taking place, partly out of a response to try and protect its own interests, but we've seen the development now of reprisals from US imperialism, with the development of the trade and tariff wars which are taking place. We've seen the recent acceleration of that, where there's been a banning of Chinese apps in India. There was rumours at the weekend of further action being taken on other apps in the United States as well. So we see the development of this growing conflict and the development of rapid acceleration of the trade conflicts and trade war. There's an uncoupling taking place between China and the US. Now, the question is, Claire, what's going to be the consequences of that for the Chinese economy? And how is that going to impact on the global economy? Because it forms such a crucial part now of the global economy. But what's the prospects for the Chinese economy with the growing antagonisms and conflicts which are taking place in the global showdown between the US and China?
Well, you've mentioned how rapidly the economy has grown, even in the last 10 years. And one of the aims of the Beijing regime, the government in Beijing, is to double the size of the economy by the end of this year, actually for celebrating the foundation of the Communist Party 100 years ago, which is very ironic. But the economy has slowed down due to the COVID-19 epidemic. In the first quarter, China lost more than 6.5% of its growth rate. It dropped. It's picked up again, and it's expected to be it's expected to do best out of any country. We don't say any capitalist country because they're capitalist raw in tooth and nail, if you like. They cover themselves by calling themselves a communist party to try and keep support from the poor people, of whom there are still very many. I could give some figures on that, many millions. Even the Prime Minister has recently expressed some concern that poverty is not being eliminated, which is what it was. Their aim was to eliminate it by the end of this year as well. But the economy, it'll pick up, but it won't regain the growth rates. In the past, it actually went up to about 20% per annum. Recently, it's been more like 6%, and it may come up to about 3% this year, 4%. It's still it's a turbocharged economy with quite a big state intervention. And what you mentioned earlier about Huawei, I can never say it probably. This decoupling, it's going to be difficult. It's going to have bad effects, not only in China itself, but actually bad effects on the countries who are trying to use some of the Chinese technology. Like in Britain, which we've seen today, not only is the big opposition within the Tory party to allowing Huawei to continue with anything in the telecommunications in Britain, also trying to get any involvement in the nuclear power industry to be decoupled or sent home, if you like. It's very difficult. China's very, very heavily involved in the economy in China. In Europe, of course, it's heavily involved in China. It's heavily involved in Europe, and with its Belt and Road project, it's driving through from Central Asia to Africa, to Latin America, and to Europe. But this problem, it's mentioned in the press today, of Britain getting rid of Huawei, it could actually lead to damaging effects on the British economy. The NIESR, National Institute for Economic and Social Research, has just said it could be up to a 1% slowing down in the economy because of this decoupling. So it's not a simple exercise. It's not certain that it will actually be completed before the trading is back on. I mean, the US wants to sell its products. The trade war, there was a sort of truce in the trade war, even as recently as January. And I saw one of Trump's representatives saying, oh, it's not true that the trade war is back on. But it is. You can see that. And Trump is desperate to be attacking China for all sorts of reasons of human rights contraventions, which he totally ignored earlier. Maybe we can go into that. I think there are a lot of unknowns in this situation.
No, of course there are, and of course, as you indicated there, I mean, even if it goes down to a growth rate of approximately 3%, which is they're talking about, I mean, that's still some fall compared to what they've had previously. And with the size of the Chinese population, it's not going to be able to satisfy or absorb it. Now, we've seen these massive movements, Claire, in Hong Kong, but what about China itself? Because if you've got this dramatic slowdown, and they've been into recession, but still, let's assume they get back to a 3% growth rate, what's going to be the effects inside China itself? You have, in China, it's the largest working class in the world. There is a substantial and sizable middle class there. What's going to be the consequences there? And what's the prospect for a social upheaval breaking out in China, which, as a consequence of the economic situation, could cut across any economic development even further and further undermine the regime?
Well, I think that a slowing down and a failure to achieve these targets will have an effect. I mean, it looks as if Xi Jinping is in a very powerful position. He's been, the General Secretary of the party and number one in China for the past 8 years, and he's actually tightened up, and clamped down on free speech. Not that much existed. I mean, it's one of the issues that needs to be taken up, particularly by the middle class. I think that sooner or later you will see the burgeoning middle class and the students actually going into a bit of a battle on the question of democratic rights. But as far as the workers' movement is concerned, it is very difficult to see, obviously, because of the secrecy, because of the clamping down even on internet protest, let alone strikes. But we have seen that China Labour News have reported over the years that there have been link-ups even across the different sections of China, so by building workers, by factory workers. And they also report that in the period of the clampdown, I call it clampdown, I mean lockdown, it's like it was a clampdown, because of the COVID crisis, that you've seen even the official so-called state trade unions reflecting some of the objections of the workers, particularly in the Wuhan area, who were made to work long hours, not getting their pay, pushed around, that they're beginning to express their discontent. And I think that we could see explosions developing at almost any moment. And as far as we're concerned, we look forward to a big development in the workers' movement. And I think the fact that that Beijing has gone into Hong Kong, we don't know how far their forces are actually going in, or they're waiting to see how this new security law is going to be implemented. But I think the fact that there's been a clampdown and some leaders have gone, it would be very difficult to organize in Hong Kong at the moment. I think it still has to be done. And it doesn't mean to say that there won't be new uprisings like in Wuhan, actually, of a few years ago. where whole communities rise up against the Beijing authorities. I think we can still see outbreaks of that kind of struggle, and we could also see huge movements on the issue of the suppression of national rights. The more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang are like in a prison camp, and they've been particularly abused in the recent period. You can't see that they're just actually going to tolerate that indefinitely. So we could see explosions, and we feel, as internationalists ourselves, that not only the Hong Kong democracy fighters haven't taken up enough on the social issues and a program for involving workers in the struggle, but that struggle needed in the past to be spread to the mainland of China. And now it may be that it starts in the mainland of China and spreads back. It's very difficult to predict, but it's not a stable, it's not a really simple situation for the leaders in Beijing, because they call themselves communists, and the ruling layer, a lot of them are billionaires. You have to stop me if I'm going on for too long, but they are doing very well out of an economy which is probably about 40% state-owned, 60% privately owned. But there's bound to be, if there's a slowing down in the economy and there's a beginning of movements from below, there will be elements who move against Xi Jinping. And we would argue, for the workers to elect their own representatives at a workplace level, at a neighborhood level, to link up and to struggle to link the democratic demands, which I think the middle class will begin to organize around. They would need to link up with workers as well, to really fight for workers' democratic control and management over the industries, both the state industries and really taking over the private industries. And, well, that's the music of the future.
Well, we look forward to see how that develops, because obviously as China has the largest working class in the world, it's in that sense become the new workshop of the world. It's going to be central for how the international situation develops in the course of the next period, particularly against the background of declining US imperialism. Now, I'd just like to appeal to our viewers once again. You can visit our website on socialistworld.net. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can like our page on Facebook, that's Socialist World-CWI. And you can follow us on Instagram, if you'd like, at Socialist World. Of course, central to this process is the question of Japan, which is the third largest imperialist power. And of course, that has been affected by the clashes that have taken place between the US and China. Japan has vested interests economically in China. At the same time, it's militarily dependent on the US in terms of protecting its position, and a certain contradiction taken place there. So maybe, Carl, could you outline what has been the response of the Japanese ruling class to this geopolitical clash?
Well, I'd say right now they're actually in quite a difficult situation. It creates a little bit of a dilemma for them. I think Claire has explained about the growth of Chinese GDP and the huge development of the Chinese economy. The largest country in the world, well, maybe India is now, but one of the largest countries in the world with massive growth and development of the productive resources. And of course, initially, the Japanese capitalists looked very favorably on this, right? A new market on their doorstep, lots of business, investment opportunities there. And, a lot of the initial capital that went in there came from Japanese companies as well. However, as the Chinese economy has grown, and now to the point where, as Claire explained, it dwarfs the Japanese economy, you've also seen a corresponding growth in the military power and strength of the Chinese state. And this has caused, well, to put it mildly, a concern in Japan, where you've got now the People's Liberation Army, the Navy, has got about 300 ships compared to the self-defense forces of Japan, only 81 ships. So you can see that alongside that economic growth has grown military power as well. And this is something that is very worrying for the Japanese ruling class. It's not their market that they own in Asia. They've got another powerful imperialist rival there. And you can see that you saw this especially in the clashes over the uninhabited islands off Okinawa, the Senkakus in Japanese. Chinese, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Diaoyu or something like that. But these uninhabited islands that led to naval clashes, and this led to basically China restricting rare earth things that were necessary, products that were necessary for a lot of the advanced technology to Japan, forced Japan to actually look for alternative sources of those raw materials. And since then, you've seen quite a change in the nature of the ruling party. The Liberal Democratic Party in Japan at one time was like an all-national party like the Italian Christian Democrats in the past, and I suppose the Conservative Party a long time ago in the UK. But it's become, and it had various ideological factions and various not particularly ideological factions based on personal interest as well. But more recently, it's become dominated by the hard nationalist right of that party, the Nihon Kyokai, the supporters of Abe. And the rise of China has been a major reason for that. And so they're torn by this situation. They're afraid of the development of Chinese power. And they need the US in the region as a counterbalance to that. So they've got the bases in Okinawa. But at the same time, they're still enormously dependent on the Chinese economy. If you look where Japanese exports go, well, United States is still the largest export market. It's just under 20%, 19.9%. China is second at 19.1%. But if you add the 4-point-something% that goes through Hong Kong, the Chinese market is actually bigger than the US market now for Japanese industry, because obviously Hong Kong doesn't consume those exports that go there. They're often forwarded into China, mainland China there. So, and if you look at the other main export markets, South Korea, Taiwan are the big ones, and they're about 6 or 7% each. So if you look at the Asian market, including China, it's the majority of Japanese exports now, as well as investment facilities, investment opportunities and things like that. And a lot of the earnings of the Japanese companies is coming from investments in foreign countries now. So it's a problem. And the Abe has even considered signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative. He's back away from that, and they're pushing this free and open Indo-Pacific now. So especially under Trump's influence, they're distancing themselves from it, but they're in a dilemma. Do they go with their main economic markets, or do they go with their main military backup? And they're not sure. I'd say it's still not certain which way they're going to go. They're talking about decoupling. A lot has been made of the Abe government. I think it was in April, announced subsidies to Japanese companies that pulled out of China. And actually, most of the subsidies were for companies if they were bring production back to Japan. However, it's not got a massive response. Companies like Toyota, probably the biggest Japanese manufacturer, have said, no, they're in the China market. They're trying to boost their electric car sales in that market, and they don't intend to pull out. So we have to see how the decoupling develops. I think it's more of a temporary measure because the supply chains were hit badly by the coronavirus and the problems with movement with China. So in a sense, it's a little bit diversifying. They don't want all their eggs in one market, but it's actually very difficult for them to totally decouple from this market. They're looking towards Vietnam now as an alternative for the for production where labor costs are important, and also to some extent Singapore and Thailand, there's a lot of investment going, but still the Chinese market dwarfs those in comparison. And not only that, we'll come on to Abenomics in a minute, I think, but you know, Japan has really been dependent on Chinese tourism. Last year, there were 8 million Chinese visited Japan as tourists. So at the beginning of the epidemic, the Japanese cities were absolutely packed with Chinese tourists going to Tokyo Disneyland or Universal Studios in Japan, which these huge entertainment workplaces, mainly unorganized, employing between them about 30,000 workers. Most of them not even granted worker status, phony contractors, things like that. So it's kept the Japanese economy rumbling on, basically, the Chinese tourism, and, well, not only China, Korea as well, but especially China. It's difficult for them to disengage.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, what you described there, Simon, is the fact that they've got a massive dilemma in terms of being under two countervailing pressures, the military political interests and their economic interests. And of course that's going to probably result in them splitting. Now, you touched upon the question of Abenomics, as it's been dubbed. Now, on the left internationally, or among some of the left internationally, you've seen this idea put forward of modern monetary theory. And that has hinged around the fact that in the advanced capitalist countries like Japan, Europe, United States, they can run up completely unprecedented debt levels, and that those debt levels continue indefinitely, and it doesn't matter whatsoever, and they just continue pumping up the bubble. Now, they've pointed to the fact that Japan is an example as how that can be, how that debt level can be sustained. Of course, Japan has a phenomenal debt level, but is it not true that in effect what you've had is 20 years of stagnation in Japan, where every single conceivable economic policy on a capitalist basis has been attempted to stimulate the economy, and not one of them has worked? So what's your views on that, Carl? What do you see in terms of the real social and economic situation facing the Japanese working class and the Japanese young people at this stage?
Well, we had the 10 lost years, and then we had 20 lost years. I'd say we'd have 30 years of low growth and stagnation. Within that, we've had recessions and we've had periods of relative growth. But it's pretty sad that any section of the left should endorse Abenomics as any kind of way forward. It's really scooping the dregs from the bottom of the barrel there. If you look at, since Abe announced his policy in 2012, the highest growth rate Japan has seen, I think, is about 2.1%. 2019, the year before the coronavirus, it was only 0.6% growth. And basically, Japan just hasn't returned to the period of rapid growth. Now, we said in the past when the CWI took issue with Keynesian ideas that had the same kind of support from the sections of the left in the labour movement. And we pointed out that it was only the governments of the richest imperialist countries that took those ideas seriously. And I think it's the same with Abenomics as well. I mean, it's only possible because of certain peculiarities of the situation in Japan. A, they haven't had to borrow that money from other countries. They've been able to borrow that money domestically. And the second thing is that they have massive savings. Now, those savings were expected to decrease with the aging population, but they haven't because of the massive profits that have been made by Japanese companies. And I should actually say here that although the Chinese economy is much bigger, in terms of the world's creditor, they're almost equal at present. Japan was actually higher last year, if you don't include Hong Kong. But you've seen that from Japan's investments abroad in massive profits. The rate of return on investment is much higher when they invest abroad, and they've had this flow of capital and earnings into them. In fact, at the end of last year, I think the Financial Times had an article where it said that that I think it was the cash reserves of the Japanese companies was 130% of GDP. It was 1.3 times the gross domestic product. So basically, they've been able to borrow and keep spending money. But what's the effect of it? It hasn't gone back to the glory days. Abe has been urging, the companies are sitting there with these cash reserves. They don't invest them in Japan to develop production. Abe was even urging them to give workers pay increases to boost domestic demand. Of course, they weren't going to do that either. So this money, it's like a black hole sucking the investment funds from the world economy and sitting in Japanese bank accounts, an enormous amount of money. So that's why they've been able to do this, but to very little effect. It's not revitalized Japanese capitalism. That's the thing. And although I say it hasn't revitalized it, but it has meant a slow relative decline. Basically, we got, before the coronavirus hit, we had full employment with the building boom for the Olympics and tourism. So you haven't seen the kind of decline that I think you've seen in some of the imperialist powers like Britain or the US, and the social decline there as well. Rather, you've seen a fraying at the edges. You've seen the increasing number of irregular workers, smaller numbers in full-time employment. The numbers employed in industry have declined because of replacement by machinery of labor within Japan. So you've seen a relative decline. The reports of child poverty increasing massively. It's certain sections of the Japanese community, but still, it's not the same level of crisis, mass unemployment. Very briefly, in 2009, I think just after the recession, you'd see older unemployed workers sleeping rough on the stations, mainly building workers who'd been there closed, but they hadn't got jobs and they hadn't got homes. Some of them would be working, get work irregularly, but not enough to pay for accommodation. So, but that is with Abenomics, it has actually, there's been a certain improvement and recovery, but that recovery has really hit a block. So that's the problem they're at now. They've tried everything, but it's not solved the problems. And really, the fact that what they call it modern monetary theory, you know, this is one of the world's creditor, one of the richest imperialist powers, and the best it could do is 2.1% growth in 1 year. Is not impressive, and it's not something that I think socialists should be advocating.
No, well, that's very illuminating and really an answer to those who put forward such ideas, or point to Japan as an example of how you can accumulate massive debt and try and overcome some of the problems capitalism faces. Now, we have reports, Carl, that we have a new peak of the COVID virus in Japan at this particular point in time. So what are the prospects of a new health crisis? How's the government going to manage the situation? And it'd be very illuminating, I think, for our viewers, if you could outline what's the position of the Japanese workers and the trade unions at this stage. You have a relatively large communist party in Japan. What's that advocating? And what sort of program would supporters of the CWI put forward in Japan as the third largest imperialist power at this stage? Okay,
well, on the coronavirus, first of all, we're seeing basically, we had this lockdown that went on until May. They closed the schools. Certain areas, the main industrial areas of the country, were locked down in a kind of loose lockdown for a period of time. However, even though we've had less than 1,000 deaths up until now, the government hasn't gained largely from this. In fact, it's discredited itself in a lot of ways because of the response to it. First of all, well, I probably haven't got time to go into all the details of its mistakes, but it made a number of mistakes. I mean, they tried to open up just as in April, as there was a major surge in coronavirus cases. They tried to reopen the schools, which had been shut since February, and were forced to retreat on this because it was obviously inappropriate. Now, on May, I think it was May the 17th, they ended the state of emergency nationally, and Abe announced, we've beaten the coronavirus. The only thing is they haven't. We're seeing now a resurgence in the coronavirus. Now, what people are being told was, yeah, but this is different. It's mainly young people. It started in a lot of the nightclubs and the pubs, entertainment areas. But it's now spreading from those areas. What they're saying is, well, the health service isn't overburdened right now, and it's mainly young people. And there are very few deaths, and it's true. There are very few deaths now because deaths lag behind infections by about 20 days. So we'll see what the real situation is with serious cases and deaths in about 2 or 3 weeks from now. But even if it is young people, mainly young people at this stage who have light symptoms, there's no war. Old people are not being locked away. You've got an aging population, and there's new evidence that it is spreading amongst older people as well. More serious cases are increasing. Well, we'll have to see. There's a lot of factors involved with an epidemic, and I don't think as Marxists we should necessarily be charting out the course of the epidemic. But it's just at this time when they're relaxing all the measures, they're urging, because foreign tourism has collapsed, they're urging people to travel in Japan. So we've got areas that have never had any coronavirus cases, or very few, are now getting infections, exploding. If you look at the studies that are done on people with antibodies, it's still the badly affected areas like Tokyo and Osaka are still under 1% showing signs of antibodies. So they're nowhere near any herd immunity. I think one of the factors is once again, they don't want to cancel the Olympics, and they want to maintain something in the Olympics for next year. And they can't do that if they don't allow sports stadiums to reopen and things like that. Now, just onto the labour movement, because the Communist Party is relatively strong compared to communist parties in a lot of countries in the world. Basically, though, there's an opinion poll yesterday, 2% identify as Communist Party supporters. There's a much bigger floating left or liberal vote that will vote for them as a consistent opposition party on things like the Constitution, defend the present Constitution, things like that. A lot of the kind of leftish voters know that if you vote for the Communist Party, they're not likely to abandon what they're saying next week, because the other parties won't let them near power. And that's one of the things. But the Communist Party has actually moved over to the centre in the last period. It's been cooperating with these liberal and centrist parties. It's never been a mass party of the Japanese working class. When that party existed, it was the Socialist Party, which is now the remnants of it standing at 0.6% in the opinion polls. So the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, to be honest, right now, the left is very weak. And most of the forces that were around the Socialist Party in the past are in these liberal, like the main opposition, Constitutional Democratic Party. They don't raise any class issues. They may oppose the consumption tax, things like that, but they mainly deal with the constitution, democratic rights, corruption in the government. Effectively, they're liberal parties, and the Communist Party as well, to be frank, it gives a more of a left gloss on this, but is a liberal party. It has put socialism is first Japan has to achieve an advanced stage of capitalism, and then maybe sometime in the future we can move towards socialism. So effectively, the policies now, they're liberals. None of them raise the ideas of socialism. And there is a complication. In the past, the idea of socialism, far more than in a country like Britain, was associated with Stalinism, support for Russia or China. And of course, that even within the Socialist Party, where the dominant factions were pro-Russian or pro-Chinese. So you've seen a collapse of those parties. Now, we look towards the labour movement and the working class to change that. But there's a number of factors. The trade union movement is about 17% organisational rate. The majority of those are in conservative company unions, which sometimes they radicalise if there are redundancies or issues like that. But as long as they guarantee the jobs, they tend to be quite tightly under the control of the companies. And I think it's about 3/4 of the union membership are in those companies. The rest, a load of public sector workers unions that don't have the right to strike. And then you get much smaller unions that tend to be more radical, who are organising the irregular workers, other sections of workers not employed in big companies. And there has been attempts to try and build industrial organisations, but they've suffered often quite severe attacks. And I know we've covered the issue of the ready-mix concrete workers in Osaka, where the leaders were arrested and held by the police for over a year. They weren't convicted of any crimes. They were held for over a year. Even now they've been released, they're not allowed to communicate with other union activists. So quite severe repression. The Japanese police can hold people for over a month, well, just under a month, sorry, without access to a lawyer. And people are regularly rearrested. People are regularly released and then rearrested on slightly different charges. So although Japan has all the trappings of democracy, there are kind of, it's only used in extreme cases. It's not, you know, the police are normally quite mild, but they have, wherever there's been moves to form industrial workers, there have been very severe attacks on them. So I think things will start to change. Things are fraying at the edge. They're using the irregular workers to worsen the conditions of the permanent workers. I think probably the change, first of all, when you get a big upsurge of the labour movement, it tends to come from fresh, unorganised workers moving to get organised. So I suspect it's going to be this layer of irregular workers. I was at a union, the regional body of our union federation, the union federation that I'm a member of, last week, and all the unions that were growing were unions that were largely organising irregular workers. So there's that division within the working class, and I'm not saying here that only the other workers are bought off or anything like that, but probably it's going to take a mixture of movements of the irregular workers to form unions, victories, then movements of other workers coming in. So it's quite difficult to raise things clearly. There are some other developments as well. There's a kind of small, radical, I suppose you could say some kind of leftist party that actually got quite a big vote in the Tokyo governor's election and run by an ex-actor. But it's not what I would describe as a workers' party. It has support of some trade union activists, as the Communist Party does as well. But there's no major force on the left at this stage. And there's still the full effects of capitalism and capitalist decline haven't hit Japan to at the same stage as they have in Europe or the US yet. So we're still lagging behind. But there are movements taking place. There are strikes. The issue of war, clashes with China is very important as well. There's still quite strong pacifist feelings. Opposition to militarization, maybe less than there was, but it's still there, quite strong. So basically, that's a summary of the situation. What do? Well, we're very small, but we argue for the labour movement to take a radical stance, for fighting unions, to organise the unorganised, for unions independent of management, which is a major issue here as well. So basically, that's the kind of thing that we're arguing for.
Okay, well, that was very informative, Carl. Thanks very, very much. Well, that brings us to the end of what I think has been a very informative broadcast this week. We'd like to thank you for watching. You can, of course, go to our website at socialistworld.net to find out more information about the CWI. To support us, we encourage you to take a look at our Patreon, where you can subscribe with a monthly fee to donate towards CWI Media. All donations are obviously welcome, but for £20 a month, we'll send you a CWI welcome pack, which will include socialist reading material, a CWI flag, and some other extras. To subscribe and to become a patron, go to patreon.com/CWI-, which will be linked in the description below on the screen. Additionally, you can make a one-off donation at paypal.me/donate to CWI, which will also be linked on the screen below. But if you're unable to make a donation, of course, we understand that. We'd appeal to you to dig deep into your pockets because we need your support. We get no backers from big business. And we'd appeal to you, if you agree with what you've heard today, if you agree with what you read on our website and other material, don't just read the material, get involved in the struggle, join the CWI, and let's march forward boldly fighting for a new socialist alternative. So thank you again for watching. We'll be back again next week discussing another aspect of this pandemic and the global crisis of capitalism which has now opened up.